It's really great to be here, and we're looking at the question, has science cancelled God? And this is a question that is close to my heart because really my journey to faith in Jesus Christ has involved this very question myself. Growing up, I didn't know what I believed about God. I grew up in a kind of religiously neutral home, I guess, if you like. But what I did know was that I wanted to be a scientist. And so someone has told me that I've already said this, but I'm going to say it again. I always did my science and maths homework first as a teenager. I loved the sciences. I decided at the age of 14 I wanted to do a PhD in something because I loved the idea of really digging in to some aspect of the natural world. I studied at university. I studied biochemistry in Bristol, not too far from here. And went on to do a PhD in brain imaging, which is functional MRI, a way of looking inside the human brain. And I, without cutting into it, I did a PhD, a postdoc after that in the US at the Medical College of Wisconsin, looking at human cocaine abuse. So I was looking at the impact of drugs on the human brain. And so I have spent 7 years in research and a total of 10 years as a scientist before moving into this area of kind of thinking about the questions that we have. Now, today I am a Christian, but I haven't always been. I remember my A-level biology teacher giving me a copy of a book by someone called Richard Dawkins, and this book was The Selfish Gene, and this was a book that I kind of read and absorbed kind of unquestioningly. But what it was saying was that we were material beings, and that there is no ultimate meaning or purpose except for the fact that we are material beings in motion. And in my very first week at university, in Freshers Week, I was invited to an event known as Guerrilla Christian. And there were there were 4 Christians, a panel, and there was a room full of people. This was in the 1990s. And I listened to all the questions that other people were asking. And then halfway through the evening, I put my own hand up and asked my own question. Surely you can't believe in God and be a credible scientist at the same time. And I was given the answer that yes, you can. And actually, that was a game changer for me. I'd never heard a response, and we're going to look at the kind of thing that I was told in that answer. But it set me on a journey of asking a lot more questions and grilling a lot more Christians over the subsequent 18 months. And tonight we're looking at the question of whether science has cancelled God or not. And this is an important question because science is held in very high esteem in society, isn't it? Particularly in Western culture. If a scientist says something, well, it must be true. The work of scientists, doctors and engineers undoubtedly has made a huge difference. It has sent people into space, helped us develop AI for better or worse, has sequenced every gene in the human body, and has increased the length and quality of human life through all kinds of medicines and treatments. There's no question that science, technology, and medicine have had a huge impact and continue to have a huge impact on our existence. But this question assumes that science and God offer competing perspectives on the world, and that we must choose between them. To ask the question, has science cancelled God, is asking us to choose between a mechanistic explanation or the fact that God might exist as well. And that's a bit like asking someone to choose between these 2 reasons as to why Amazon exists. Either, you have to choose, either because there's a website, there are distribution centers, there are home deliveries, employees, an HR system, and so on, or because Jeff Bezos exists and wanted to set up an online company. Choose. And of course, you think about that for 1 second and think, We don't need to choose. Those are two parallel explanations as to why Amazon exists. And in fact, trying to answer the question, why does Amazon exist, only in terms of the underlying mechanisms, leaves you with a diminished understanding of why it exists. But these two explanations together give you a more complete understanding of reality. And it's essentially no different with God and science. There's no contradiction between studying the underlying mechanisms in the natural world and belief in God who created it all and continues to uphold and sustain it today. And so it is not the case that the study of mechanisms in the natural world has removed the need for God. We could argue that together they give a more complete picture of reality. Now, one way that this question comes up is this whole idea of creation versus evolution. One of the questions that I know that the team were thinking about in preparation is, does science prove that creation is a myth? Again, here's the assumption that there are these two options that you have to choose between, and it's either or. And this is an example of a faulty dilemma, and the whole science-God conversation is actually littered with faulty dilemmas where it feels like there's just two options and you choose one or another. And in this case, it's either you believe the six-day account of creation in Genesis 1, or you believe the scientific accounts that are out there as well. This was something that I wrestled with in my own journey of asking questions. Do I need to discount my scientific understanding of the world in order to believe in God? Do I need to choose? What I came to realize is that Christians believe different things about creation and evolution. It is possible to be a Christian and take one of a number of different positions on this. There are some Christians that would call themselves young earth creationists, that would take a very literal reading of Genesis 1 and would say that actually, the history of life as we know it has come about very supernaturally in a very short period of time. So that's one possible position. Another position that Christians might hold is what's known as old earth creationism, where they would accept what cosmology is telling us about the age of the universe and what geology is telling us about the age of the earth, and would believe that there are both natural and supernatural processes involved in the bringing about of life as we know it. So that's old earth creationism. And then there's evolutionary creationism. And this category, people that hold this view would say that the days of Genesis are 6 evolutionarily long periods of time, and that this mechanism is a mechanism that God somehow used to bring about life, particularly biological life. And so one thing that I came to learn is that there's room for difference in this area. Christians have a way of getting very passionate about creation and evolution. What I came to discover is that it is possible to be a Christian and hold one of a number of different views on this. And what does that mean for you if you're exploring faith, if you're wondering, what I wondered, do I need to discount my scientific knowledge, my scientific understanding of the world in order to consider God? I want to give that a very emphatic no. Because actually, if it's true that God has made the natural world, and he's also been the overseer of the Bible that we now, that we read, that Christians read, then actually those two things are not going to be in contradiction to each other. The contradiction comes at the level of interpretation. Either through the scientist making sense of the world or the theologian making sense of the Bible. That's where the level of contradiction comes. But God himself has consistently made himself known in the world through his word and through nature itself. And so there's room for difference. And there are a number of features of Genesis. Now, we haven't read this text, but there are a number of features that certainly leave room for scientific accounts that indicate an old Earth and an even older universe. You see, time in Genesis 1 and 2 is ambiguous. The very first words of the Bible say this: "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Well, how long did that take? There are no indicators of time here. And then it says, "Now the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep." Well, how long was darkness over the surface of the deep? And then it says that the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Well, how long was the Spirit of God hovering over the waters? You see, time in Genesis is ambiguous. There are all kinds of things that indicate that this may not necessarily be able to be looked at in a straightforward way. There's also the question of how long is a day. The Hebrew word for day is used many times in Genesis, and it's a three-letter word, yom, Y-O-M. And it's used in different ways within Genesis 1 and throughout the Bible. For example, if you were to read verses 3 to 5, it says, "And God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day." And this is the important bit. There was evening, and then there was morning, the first day. And so here, day refers to the period when it is light. Oh, sorry, no. The first bit is day refers to the period when it is light, in contrast to night. God saw that let there be light, there was light. God saw that the light was good. He separated the light from the darkness, and God called the light day. So day refers to the period when it is light. And so maybe that's more like a 24-hour period than a 12-hour period than a 24 one. And of course, we know, particularly living in Britain, that the length of the day in terms of when it's light depends on the location and the time of year. So how long is a day? And then you read the next line and it says, "There was evening and there was morning, the first day." So here, day refers from the period from evening to morning. So that's when it's dark. And that's referred to again a few times in verses 8 and 13. You see, the point that I want to make here is day refers to different things in Genesis. And then in verse 14, markers of time were not introduced until day 4. The sun and the moon, referred to as the greater light and the lesser light, they weren't even introduced until day 4. So how was time even marked before that? And God said in verse 14, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark seasons and days and years." And so the point that I'm making here is day, even if you look at the Hebrew text, means different things at different times. The use of day is ambiguous, and the language of day is used elsewhere in the Bible to denote long time periods. So one such use would be in Psalm 90, where Moses, a man of God, is praying, and he says, "For 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night." In other words, 1,000 years are like a day, and a day is like 1,000 years. And we see this actually being repeated in a few different places in the Bible. So it's not clear cut, really. And so I want to, it also raises the question, or the helpful question for us to ask here, what kind of literature is Genesis 1 and Genesis 1 and 2? If we could just move the slides on, thank you. You see, the Bible it's not a one-size-fits-all flat document. The Bible contains lots of different kinds of literature, and it's really, in order to read something well, it's important to understand what the author was trying to say and how they were trying to say it. The Bible contains poetry and prose and songs, like in the Psalms and the Song of Solomon. It contains parables, Jesus stories. It contains allegory, a story or poem that has a hidden meaning. It contains fables, stories in which inanimate objects speak and act. It records history. It has eyewitness accounts. It has chronology, such as in Exodus and Deuteronomy. It has correspondence. The Apostle Paul writes a lot of letters, and there are prayers and dreams and visions that are written down as well. There are many types of literature in the Bible, and so a helpful question is to ask, what kind of literature is Genesis? And that are actually, there are some theologians that say that this is actually a piece of creative writing about events that really did happen, a bit like you might write a poem about World War II. You're writing about events that did happen, but you're not writing about it in a literal, historical way. And if you try and read the poem like that, you will miss the intended meaning of the author. And it is David Wilkinson, the theologian, who says that Genesis 1 that is not primarily a passage about the how of creation, nor even primarily the why of creation. Rather, it's a passage about the who of creation, and is an overture that introduces us to the Creator God. He would say that to discuss times and dates regarding Genesis is to miss the point. The purpose of Genesis 1 is to introduce the main character of the Bible, God himself. And it is written into a context of polytheism. The author writing this is in a context where there are those around him that believe that there are many gods and that those gods are somehow divine and tied up with nature and the creation process. According to these creation stories, was a battle of these gods of nature for ultimate supremacy. But the author of Genesis is saying, no, there's actually one God who created everything that we see in nature, but nature itself is not divine. There are not many gods. There's one God who created all that we see, but nature itself is not divine. And this is enforced many times, and we see it highlighted. I mentioned earlier the markers of time that are introduced in day 4, in verse 16. The wording here is that God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. These two lights refer to the sun and moon, but the Hebrew specifically uses these other terms because the words for sun and moon in ancient Near Eastern culture refer to gods. They refer to deities. But the author of Genesis is saying, no, the sun and the moon are not divine. They are simply lights created by the one true God. But they themselves are not worthy of worship. We also see this in this throwaway line. He also made the stars in verse 16. For some, the stars were gods controlling human destiny. But here the stars are so unimportant compared with the greatness of God that their mention is a literal one-liner. He also made the stars. And we see this actually time and time again. There's lots of other examples that I could make and that I could use here. But essentially, the Genesis author is saying that God has no rivals in creation. His word is supreme. He speaks and it is done. It's not that there are many gods of the forces of nature battling it out for supremacy. There's one God who created the whole of nature, but nature itself is not divine. God is sovereign over nature and yet is distinct from it. So what does this mean as we come to our break now? What does this mean in terms of the creation narrative and the scientific accounts? It means that there is room in the Genesis 1 account to actually incorporate some scientific understanding, which means that you do not need to choose. As I said earlier, if God exists, then he has made himself known both in nature, what theologians call natural revelation, and also in the Bible, what we might call special revelation. And those two things are not in contradiction with each other. And what that means is you don't need to choose. So that's the first section that I wanted to just spend a little bit of time on, the creation evolution question. In the second half, we're going to look a little bit more about the kinds of question that science can't answer that leave room for the possibility of God. So that will have a little bit of a different feel, but I think we're going to have a hot chocolate break at this point, so I will hand back over to Matt for that. Wonderful. Let's continue with this question. Has science cancelled God? And in the second half, I would like to look at the questions that science cannot answer. Much as I love the sciences, and hopefully you're coming away with it's possible to be a person that is totally passionate about the sciences and still believe in God. But science can't answer all of our questions, and there are some questions in particular that I want to look at. So the first question that science can't answer is why science works at all. Can science tell us why science works in the first place? It's worth asking the question, how is it that we can even do science? Now, already we're out of the realm of science and into philosophy. This is not a scientific question. This is a philosophical question. And two things are needed for science to be possible. And the first thing that is needed for science to be possible is that nature, the natural world, needs to be regular and predictable. If you were to set up a scientific study here in Southampton, and you know that you're onto something, and you go and you repeat that study in London at one of the universities there, what should you find? You should find the same results. It's kind of so obvious we don't really think about it, but there's an underlying order to the natural world without which we can't do any science. We can't repeat studies and start to see trends which then become, leads to kind of theory development and so on. But where does this order come from? What's the best explanation for the order that we see in the natural world? And, our kind of atheistic, materialistic accounts that it all comes from a purely blind, unguided process, are they the most persuasive explanations? And there were a number of scientists in the history of science when it was kind of really growing exponentially who contributed significantly to the modern scientific revolution. People like Johannes Kepler, Isaac Newton, Calvin, Mendel, and so on. And they were all theists who actually believed in God, and it was their belief in God that drove forward their science. And they expected to find order in nature because they believed there was an orderer behind it. And as C.S. Lewis put it, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. And even today, there are many influential scientists whose beliefs inspired their science. Actually, another historic one is James Clerk Maxwell, the first Cavendish professor of physics. And he is famous for having words from Psalm 11. I've put Psalm 112 there. Psalm 111, verse 2, written above the door of the Cavendish labs at the University of Cambridge. They say this: "Great are the works of the Lord. They are pondered by all who delight in them." Those words were written, inscribed above the doors of the Cavendish labs at the University of Cambridge. This is a scientist very well known for his work on electromagnetic theory, but he saw his science as a means of pondering the works of God. Far from one having cancelled the other, he saw his science as a means of pondering and delighting in the world that God had made, and to great effect. And of course, today we could point to people like Francis Collins, famous now for not only overseeing the Human Genome Project and being the director of the National Institutes on Health in the USA, but also directing the vaccine rollout during the COVID-19 pandemic. And he has said many things, including that God is most certainly not threatened by science. He made it all possible. And so there are scientists on both sides of this debate. There are those who believe that science has cancelled God, and there are those who believe that God actually makes science possible. So that's the one thing, that the natural world needs to be ordered and regular. The second thing we need for science to proceed is for the human mind to be able to think rationally and to make sense of the world, that we have a conscious mind. As human beings, we have a curiosity about the world right from infancy. We want to investigate and make sense of things that we don't understand, and we're able to think logically and rationally about the world. Well, where does this come from? And especially if our atheist friends are right and we live in a purely material world, a closed system of cause and effect, and somehow conscious beings with a rationally thinking mind have emerged from within that system. Some very bright people believe this. One such person would be Francis Crick, famous for co-discovering the DNA double helix along with James Watson, who later wrote this. I'll read out a longer version. He said that your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. You're nothing but a pack of neurons. How do you feel about that? Is this the best story that can be told about the human mind and where it comes from? And the problem with this view is a cataclysmic one, actually. And it is this: how could non-conscious neurons generate conscious humans, especially if all we have to work with is matter? Non-conscious matter. How can non-conscious atoms and molecules generate conscious you? That is not a done deal. That is not straightforward. That has been debated since the ancient world and is still being debated today. And in no way has science drawn a line under this and said that is how we explain the human mind. Apologies for the shameless book plug, but my book, Am I Just My Brain, talks about that a little bit more. But what is the most persuasive explanation for why we happen to be here as conscious thinking beings? You see, if God does not exist, then we live in a non-conscious universe of time plus matter plus chance. And for conscious humans to arise from within that, it's not impossible, But it's surprising, right? And yet, if God does exist, then we have lived in a conscious universe all along. We didn't start with matter. We started with God in a conscious community of Father and Son and Holy Spirit. And through this God, all things were made, including human beings and their brains. And so actually a case can be made that the very existence of the conscious mind that we have makes more sense if God exists than if he doesn't. Isn't it ironic that we're here on the back foot trying to explain why science hasn't cancelled God? You could make a case that actually God is the one that made it all possible in the first place. He's the one that gave us the minds that we use in the advance of the sciences, and he created the order in the natural world such that we can press into it and study it. It's extraordinary. It rests much more securely on theism than atheism, that you can even be a scientist at all. Because the regularity in nature and the rationality of the human mind make more sense if there is an orderer behind both of them, an intelligent being known as God. Which is why Richard Swinburne, Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at the University of Oxford, has said, "Note, I am not postulating a God of the gaps, a God merely to explain the things that science has not explained. I postulate God to explain why science explains." Or John Polkinghorne, the late John Polkinghorne, a Cambridge professor of physics and an Anglican priest, he says this: "We are so familiar with the fact that we can understand the world that most of the time we take it for granted, but it is what makes science possible. Yet it could have been otherwise. The universe might have been a disorderly chaos rather than an orderly cosmos, or it might have had a rationality which was inaccessible to us. There is a congruence between our minds and the universe, between the rationality experienced within and the rationality observed without." The very fact of science itself makes more sense if God exists than if he doesn't. A second question that science can't answer is our big fundamental questions about existence and life and the universe. Can science answer those kinds of questions? Well, not really, because even if we had all of our questions about chemistry, physics, and biology answered, there would still be a lot of questions that remain unanswered. Questions like, why are we even here? Why do we exist? Why can I think? What is the purpose of my life? Why is there so much suffering? Is there life beyond death? And of course, we know that these are not scientific questions, but they are very important ones. And we need to step beyond the boundaries of science in order to answer them. And of course, perhaps an example of how this plays out is when we think about the beginnings of the universe. You know, we now know, cosmologists now tell us that nearly 14 billion years ago, all the matter in the universe was concentrated into a singularity, which then rapidly expanded to form our solar system and others via the means of the Big Bang. Could you pop the next slide on? Thank you, Steve. Oh, okay. Right, okay, fine. And the Big Bang may answer the question of how the universe got started, but it doesn't tell us why it exists at all. Why? It doesn't answer that question. It tells us how, but it doesn't tell us why. And so even though we've got this beautifully elegant way of thinking about the origins of the universe, it doesn't answer all of our questions. There are many questions that science cannot answer. And Sir Peter Medawar put it very well. The existence of a limit to science is made clear by its inability to answer childlike elementary questions having to do with first and last things. Questions such as, how did everything begin? What are we all here for? And what is the point of living? And you know, if we look just to scientific accounts, we see that human beings are incredibly insignificant. Cosmologists tell us that we sit here on a spinning mass of rock, metal, water, and gas that is 4.5 billion years old in a cosmos of 14 billion years old. And Homo sapiens has only been here for the last 200,000 years. And so if we think of the time since the earth formed until now as a 24-hour period, human beings appeared at 23, 59, and 59 seconds. We are the last second. And probably even that is an overestimate. And that's the entire Homo sapiens race. One human life, even less insignificant. Is that the narrative that we are to take? Is that where we take our cues from in terms of our significance as a human race and as individual people? You see, if God exists, the significance of human life, of every human life, is disproportionate to the scientific account. A few years ago, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the moon landings, 2019. And some of you may know that Buzz Aldrin, one of the 3 astronauts that disembarked onto the moon, was a Christian. And he actually took communion in the spaceship before they disembarked. And of course, with the much lower gravity strength there, the wine was curling its way up the cup, and he was trying to kind of do that. Anyway, he did that. And anyway, on their journey back to Earth, he asked for silence in NASA, and he read these words from Psalm 8. He said, "When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you've set in place, what is mankind that you are mindful of them? Human beings that you care for them. You made them a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned them with glory and honor." You know, when he was confronted with the vastness of space, it can seem like human beings are extraordinarily insignificant. But if God exists, every life is important. Every human being matters. We're even told that God knows extraordinary details about every human being. He knows every thought before we think it. He knows the number of hairs on our head. Extraordinary. And so we can't simply look to the scientific account. The scientific account cannot speak to human significance. You matter. The fact that you are even here tonight matters. God is a God who sees people, even those that feel invisible and unseen, unrecognized. There's something extraordinary about the fact that this God is the creator of the cosmos and yet knows every single person. And he calls you, he calls us by name to himself. Because he loves what he's made. So science cannot speak to human significance. And finally, science cannot answer the God question. Whether or not God exists is probably the most important question of all, but we need to look beyond science to, again, gain answers or responses to this. And we don't need to abandon reason. You see, many people assume that to exercise faith is something you do against your better judgment. That to be a person of faith is to be willing to believe in irrelevant things that have no bearing on life. It is to dispense with logic. And here's another faulty dilemma that we see in this whole conversation. The assumption often is I can either be a thinker or I can be a person of faith. Well, once again, you don't actually need to choose. But we see this illustrated, for example, in the words of Richard Dawkins in 1992 at the Edinburgh Festival, where he described faith as the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, perhaps even because of, the lack of evidence. And he was the Charles Simeoni Professor of the Public Understanding of Science for a long time. And if Richard Dawkins says it, then perhaps it must be true. But if we take the face value meaning of faith to be trust in something or someone, we see that everyone has faith in something. We just differ with the things that we place our weight in, the things that we place our trust in. But we always exercise that faith, not in a blind way, not in an unthinking way, but on the basis of evidence. If you put your faith in a professor at your university, it's on the basis of their skill and their expertise and their care for you as a student. If you put your faith or trust in a family member, it's because they've got a lifetime of showing themselves to be trustworthy. Or you might have a lower level of faith in them if they've let you down. But either way, the level of faith is proportional to the evidence to support it. And it is actually no different in the Christian faith. To put your faith in the person of Jesus Christ is to put your faith in a person who walked the earth 2,000 years ago in first century Palestine and showed himself to be trustworthy. When people put their faith in him, it wasn't in a blind way. It was on the basis of that here was a living, breathing, fully God, fully man being who treated people in a way that they'd never seen before, with dignity, with respect, who brought people from the margins of society right back into the center, who came alongside people in their suffering and healed diseases and sicknesses and even reached into death and raised people from the dead as well. There was good reason to follow Jesus in first century Palestine. It was never an unthinking thing to do. It was never a blind thing. And it's the same today. And of course, we don't have Jesus himself in front of us, but we have the documents that point to his life. Actually, before I say more about that, one of the biographers of the life of Jesus was a physician, Luke, who was a medically trained man. One of the Gospels written by a doctor. And he didn't see his allegiance to Jesus as holding back his work as a doctor. In another biography, we see Jesus engaging with someone skeptical who wanted concrete evidence and wanted very specific evidence that Jesus was who he said he was. And in John's biography, Thomas says, because his other friends, the other disciples had seen the risen Jesus. He had died and he'd risen again, and they'd seen him. But Thomas, for some reason, wasn't there. And he wasn't willing to just take their word for it. He said, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. And Jesus doesn't disregard Thomas's need for evidence. He actually gives him the evidence that he asked for in a very specific way. And this is Caravaggio, the 16th century artist, depicting this moment of Thomas meeting Jesus and literally seeing the marks on his hands and side. You see, it's been my experience, and I think the experience of others as well, that God doesn't ask us to take a blind leap into the dark. To exercise faith is not a blind, unthinking thing to do. It is actually to examine the evidence and go where the evidence leads. And today we have the manuscripts that document the life of Jesus, that if you want to describe those as unreliable, you actually have to discount every other historical document that there is. Such is their trustworthiness. and the extent that they've been preserved over time, you can trust what you're reading. If you're thinking about who Jesus is, if you're not sure what you believe, I'm sure that this church would be delighted to just give you a Bible if you want to have a look for yourself at the life of Jesus. Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, about 2/3 of the way through the Bible. And it says in one of those, John's Gospel, that Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples that are not recorded in this book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. You see, there is evidence that you can examine kind of in a scientific way, which means that people of faith can be thinkers, and thinkers can be people of faith. So I want to ask you, have you examined the evidence? Have you looked at what is out there, that God hasn't actually left it kind of in a woolly, kind of slightly unknown manner? He has actually made himself known. He's given us things we can grapple with and take a look at and decide what we think. Have you done that? Can I encourage you to do it? It's the most important decision you will ever make. My story is that, I described the beginning of it, my first week in Bristol, and then, another 18 months of grilling Christians and asking all kinds of questions. And about halfway through that, I got to the stage where I didn't have every question answered. I still have questions, actually. But I had had enough answered to know that Jesus, I believed that Jesus was who he said he was, that he really had lived. He really had died for me. And actually his death for me made sense, that actually I couldn't rescue myself. I couldn't even be the person I wanted to be by my own standards, let alone by anyone else's. But Jesus had borne my sin, my brokenness, and offered me a new start, offered me forgiveness and new life, and had actually gone on to rise from the dead, almost like as a kind of a proof that everything else he said and did was true and real and meant something. And so actually I put my faith in Jesus. I don't really have a definitive moment that happened, but an important part of it, I think, was that my housemates were Christians, and they had invited me to come to church with them one evening, and I said I wasn't going to, but I would write my biochemistry essay and then I'd jump on my bike and come join them at church for the student group that I knew met after church. And so I did that. I wrote a biochemistry essay. I'm not sure how good it was. Probably not very. And then I jumped on my bike and I went to their church. And who does that? I don't know who does that. And all I can say is that as I was cycling from our house to this church, I just had the sense that I was kind of stepping into something that was bigger than myself, that my kind of scientific mind couldn't really get a handle on. But the words that I have to describe that was that I was going home, that I was actually not just cycling from A to B, I was going home to God, to the person of Jesus, to a relationship with God, and actually with the people of God as well that I was about to go and meet with. And so and that was the beginning of a few more years in the sciences, which I loved, and studying the world that God had made, and also knowing him. That actually added something to my pursuit of the sciences. It didn't diminish it. It actually augmented it. And so I've never looked back since then. I just want to encourage anyone here, if you are seriously thinking about what you believe and who God is, can I encourage you to have a look at the life of Jesus? I'd be happy to chat to you afterwards and recommend some other things to read as well. Anything by John Lennox as well, professor of mathematics at the University of Oxford, and has written a lot on this topic as well. What I'd love to do is just really briefly pray, and then I think we're going to go into a time of questions as well. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, I thank you that you've been with us. Thank you that you know us, that you see us. Thank you that you created the natural world and you gave us the minds that we've got. And I just ask for every person here that they might know your peace, and somehow that you love them and know them and see them, and that you would help us in the time of questions and help us to feel free to ask the questions that are on our heart, Lord. And we commit this time to you, and I just pray for your blessing in Jesus' name. Amen.
You may have noticed that there's an option for you to kind of vote on some of the questions so that they get, I guess, higher priority. So let's start with those first couple of ones then. So if early Genesis is not literal, at what chapter do you think it becomes so? And how do we explain, therefore, the evidence of existence of prehistoric creatures such as
Let's
dinosaur,
do them one at a time.
Okay, just kind of thinking, linking some of them.
Yeah,
great.
Totally, yes. So thank you for these questions. And I think with this first, I want to be clear that we mustn't assume that because we're saying it's not to be read literally, that it's not historic. You can still take something to be written in a certain genre about events that actually happened. So let's make sure that, that's what I would believe, actually, that this is a creation story about events that really happened, but written in a non-literal way. So it's all describing kind of history in some way. So it's not that there's suddenly a point in Genesis at which we're talking about literal things and that there's suddenly been a shift, but there probably are different kinds of literature within the book of Genesis, and theologians talk about Genesis 1 and 2 being two different creation accounts. We didn't talk about Genesis 2 this time, but that zooms in on day 6 and focuses on that in more detail. And so, I think that that's probably a good way to approach it. That it's not suddenly that it becomes literal. There are just different kinds of literature within this document talking about events that really happened throughout. And then in terms of the existence of dinosaurs, how do we explain the existence of dinosaurs and prehistoric creatures in congruence to the creation of Earth and its dwellers? Again, so this point that if Genesis itself is not a chronological scientific account of how the world came to be, then there's room for maneuver in there to allow for what scientists are telling us about how biological life came to be on Earth. And I guess one of the things we have to grapple with is how do we make sense of predation and extinction of creatures like the dinosaurs and so on. And that does kind of require that there be some forms of death beforehand. And I mean, every position that you hold on this has its things that you need to wrestle with. And why would God allow those things to be part of this kind of narrative that is deemed good? There's a lot that we could say about that. One thing we could say is that it says that it's good, not necessarily perfect. That there's something about the wording that's being used there. It's important to say that Genesis itself doesn't preclude death. We already know that there are seed-bearing plants, and actually the plant cycle implicit in that is actually death is woven in to that. Also later on, when the serpent speaks to the man and the woman, he says, if you eat from the tree, you will certainly die. So there's a reference to death. But how would they have known what that even meant if there wasn't some concept before? And there's a lot to grapple with here. I'm not saying it's straightforward, but I think that's probably some of the things that we do need to wrestle with. But I guess somebody that would accept whether you believe in a young earth or an old earth, that actually, well, these days are periods that can allow for the existence of creatures such as that, because it's not a scientific chronological account of how the world came to be. Thank you.
Thank
for
you.
the question.
What would you say there was before this universe? What was before this universe?
I don't know. Nothing. So what's interesting about the towards the end of the 19th century, physicists were of the opinion that they'd done all the hard work. There wasn't much else to discover in the realm of physics, and actually then came Einstein's theories of relativity and the Big Bang and so on. What was interesting about the discovery of the kind of planets moving away from each other, which suggested that the universe had a beginning. This is an example of a recent scientific discovery that actually is in agreement with ancient scripture, that the Bible has said all along that the universe had a beginning. And so this is a wonderful example where the scientific narrative of the day and the Bible are actually saying the same thing. Of course, there are some cosmologists now that say, well, before the Big Bang, there was still this kind of expansion and so on. But I think ultimately, obviously, we don't know. But it did have a very clear beginning, and that is in agreement with what we're seeing in the Bible. So,
thank you. If we go for the next question, why did God create the other planets in our solar system when they hold no life, nor do they impact human life on Earth?
Oh, thank you for the question. Well, I think that in terms of the physics of the Big Bang, that actually that all kinds of matter was flung outwards and formed into planets, and that was actually a part of the process of what God was doing. But I'm not. I'm not an expert on these things, but you're right to say that they don't hold life. One of the things I talk about when I talk about natural disasters is that they contain lots of natural disasters, but in a way that prohibits life. But I don't know if there's something that cosmologists would say that actually there is a function that those other planets play in making Earth habitable. I can't say more about that because I don't know, but I wonder if that might be part of it. But even if it's not, the sheer physics of flinging lots of matter outwards means that there's going to be other kind of bodies of matter around you. And so, that's partly why we have these other planets.
Thank you. I guess you kind of talked about, mentioned earlier, death coming into the world, or death being mentioned kind of in Genesis, but here we've got Romans 5:12 says death came into the world through sin, and if you hold to evolution, then death is part of that process and would predate humans. But some say it refers to spiritual death.
Yes.
Any comments on that one?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is probably the biggest wrestler that we have. Just to say that the other side of it sort of, actually no, I won't say that, I'll just kind of go with this. Yes, let me just try and locate the question. Here it is. Yes, so I think different people, again, would take different positions. Interestingly, in Romans 5, it says, through Adam, death came to all people, but it doesn't say to all living things, which again is another, allows the possibility that there might have been some forms of death before the fall of human beings, and that there's a difference between a human being made in the image of God committing murder, killing another human being, or sort of whatever it might be, and the animal kingdom kind of running on instinct and surviving and kind of doing that thing. There's actually a difference between those two things. So some people might kind of hold that view. And so I think that that's one way of looking at it. Another way that I have thought about this is to think about the possibility that the impact of the fall of Satan might have on nature. That is it possible that in addition to a human fall, that there was a pre-human fall, which we talk about in terms of the origins of evil anyway. The kind of traditional understanding is that Satan was an angel that was created good, that then fell, rebelled against God and fell. And what we see in Genesis is that the serpent is in the garden already. And before we had sin, we had temptation by transcendent evil to these early humans, Adam and Eve. And what we don't know is how long was the serpent there? What kind of influence had he had on the natural world up until that point? Is it possible that there was a brokenness that came in through the fall of Satan and then that was added onto by the fall of human beings? I find that to be at least a helpful way of thinking about this, because then we're not saying death is just the way that it's always been. This process involving predation and death and extinction and so on, that's the way that it's always been. This view actually says, no, everything was created good, but there's different levels of fall and different levels of brokenness in the world. That's something that I found helpful, but I know that others may disagree and there are different viewpoints. Yeah.
Thank you. We'll just aim for a couple more, aware that we won't be able to answer all of them in this way, but I know, Sharon, you're willing to chat to people afterwards.
Of course, yes.
So please do, come and chat afterwards.
Yes.
How does evolution and the Bible, how do they coexist? Or do they, coexist?
Oh, thank you for the question. I mean, I would simply, at its broadest level, want to say that that God created the whole of the natural world. That those that believe in that evolution is a mechanism that God used would say that it's a mechanism that he used. He imbued the natural world with the ability to kind of evolve and arrive at the different kind of species that it was supposed to arrive at, and so it's a mechanism that God has used. I would want to say that there are some points of distinction. What we often see in the scientific literature is like placing all of the weight of like trying to interpret something through the lens of an evolutionary understanding, and sometimes that's the only kind of level of interpretation that we see, and that can lead to a sort of a fairly diminished outlook on what human beings are, and why the world is the way that it is. But it's at its broadest level, Darwin's theory of how actually species adapt to their environment, and then the best adapted species are more likely to survive. I think we do see that. I think we see that. But of course, the difference between the Christian wanting to accept some aspects of it as a mechanism is very different to the way that it's held sometimes in the scientific world as a worldview in and of itself, like evolutionism. It's a lens through which we press everything to try and make sense of the world. But actually, we'd be wanting to say it's a mechanism that God has kind of imbued into the natural world, but it's not the only way of looking at things as well, and it's not the only kind of explanation, that an interpretation that we want to give in writing papers and in making sense of the world.
Great, thank you. If we go for one last one for now then. We've got here, God created the heavens and the earth. Do you think the heavens is the universes? And wouldn't that mean that when the sun was made, when God says let there be light, he's allowing for the sun to shine through?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a really thoughtful question. I think my take is that Genesis is talking about earth. It's talking about the earth from a human vantage point. And, well, actually, it is talking about other planets as well. You're right there. But I think this verse, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, is talking about God created two realms. He created the earth, which is seen and physical, and he created the heavens, which is unseen, but also very real. And I think that humans have populated earth, and angelic beings populate the heavens. But the rest of Genesis goes on to talk about that which we see. But it's under no mistake that God created the heavens, the unseen realm that is just as real, and the seen realm. And God is the creator of both of those, which is why we can then talk about in terms of the origins of evil, that God didn't create evil, he created good with the potential for evil, and that then kind of fell and became corrupted and so on. But God created good. He created the heavens and the earth. And I think this is really important that, and then with the life of Jesus, we see that the kingdom of heaven breaking in. We see that heaven breaking into earth, and that's what was so extraordinary about what God did in Jesus. And it's like, this is what it looks like when heaven begins to break in to earth, and we see those two kingdoms meeting. Of course, we see it throughout the Bible in kind of moment by moment ways, but not in the sense of like really kind of breaking in once and for all with the arrival of the author of heaven himself, the person of Jesus Christ. And so it's talking about these two realms, and sometimes I think as Christians we can forget about that dimension of things, and so it's good to be reminded in Genesis that for every event on earth that we see, there's an unseen dimension as well. There's a spiritual side to things. There are often spiritual battles as well going on for situations on earth. And so I think that's what those verses are talking about, but I might be wrong. But thank you for the question.
Sharon, thank you so much for your time and for sharing with us and unpacking some of those. As I said, please do be continuing to chat about that afterwards, and come and chat with Sharon, and her books are out in the lounge as well, which can help us grappling with these questions a bit more. But don't let this just be a one-off thing. We can continue to be asking and thinking deeper. So that'd be great. Thank you.